hopefully is mic'd up already. Yes. So first of all, we've got Katty Baird come to talk to us. She's a volunteer at the National Museums of Scotland, and she's been helping to digitise their moth collection. And in this talk, she's going to describe how the museum collections, in particular the moths and notebooks of the Edwardian naturalist Alice Balfour, has inspired her own moth recording. And how have the moths and the people recording them changed over the past 100 years? So I think this is an excellent talk to get us into the swing of things for this conference. So I'll pass over to Katty.
Okay, does that work? Okay, everyone here? And then there's that. Excuse me while I just work my way around this. Could I just use the thingy? Cool. Okay, hello everybody. So as I've just been introduced, I'm Katty Baird, and I'm all sorts of things really, but I'm a moth recorder, so that's my sort of main taxa of interest, if you like, up in East Lothian in southeast Scotland. And we're quite lucky, I guess, in East Lothian that 100 years ago, this lady called Alice Balfour did a lot of moth recording, and she bequeathed her collection and her diaries to the museum. And I've been able to go there and look at what she caught, where she caught it, and then go back with my own light traps and nets and see what I can find now. And it's been really interesting, not just to see how the moths themselves have changed or haven't changed, but also how we go about recording, in this case moths, but I think it sort of extends to all biological recording. So let's see how this goes. So this is Alice Balfour. She was born in 1850 and died in 1936. She was from a wealthy family, the Balfours. This is her house. It was built by her granddad and it's still there, but a lot of the estate has since been sold off to cover desk duties and things like that. So it's now private apartments. To give you an idea, luxury private apartments at that, to give you an idea of where it is, the estate is that red dot. So it's about 30-ish miles east of Edinburgh and not far from the coast at Dunbar. So this is an aerial view of the sort of countryside around. We're looking east towards the North Sea and Dunbar. I don't know how to use this thing. So right in the middle is Whittingham House. And you can see the land use around it. So this is a recent-ish aerial view, is farmland and woodland. And if you look at maps from 100 years ago, it was very similar land use. So it was farmland and woodland in Alice's day. But of course, the way we manage our farmland and our woodland has gone various changes over the last 100 years. And just to illustrate, these are some foresters from 1903. So these guys would have been working on the estate when Alice was there. And a few things have changed. Their PPE is quite different now to modern foresters, I think. And their tools look not quite as efficient. So obviously they'll have a different impact, but that isn't actually to say that 100 years ago they were paying an awful lot of attention to conservation and wildlife. They were not necessarily thinking about that when they chopped their trees down. So I imagine the trees in the estate now would be a completely different set from what these guys were working with. So Alice was one of 8 children. Here they all are sitting around their mum being read to, a very posed shot. Alice was the youngest daughter, so she's a rather serious looking girl by her mum's elbow. They're quite an interesting group of, well, they grew up to be quite an interesting, lead influential lives, roles, whatever, in various ways, in particular in politics and science. Perhaps the most famous was the eldest son, so that's Arthur, who's, I think, the guy on the ground with his back to us. So he had a career in politics and became Prime Minister for a bit. and is responsible for the Balfour Declaration, all sorts of political stuff if you're interested in that sort of thing. And as the eldest son, it was he who inherited the estate, and he wasn't married, and as was the sort of form back then, the role of looking after the household, the estate, managing his affairs, fell to unmarried sisters. So it would have been his wife if he'd been married, but it was unmarried sisters that took on the role, and this is what Alice ended up doing. So neither Alice nor Arthur ever married, and they living their adult lives together. She supporting his political career and managing the estate, both up in East Lothian and down in London. So they spent a lot of time in London when Parliament was sitting. So she didn't have as much time for her moths and other ventures as she would have liked, but I mustn't feel too sorry for her, because she was a privileged background. She had connection with all sorts of interesting people, and she did more than just moth collecting. So she wasn't just swinging her net around in her free time in Whittingham. She had collaborations, that might not be the right word, but with various scientists, and a particular reference to us here in Oxford. She was good friends and helped with the work of Edward Bagnall-Poulton, who was the second professor, Hope Professor of Zoology at the University of Oxford here. And he was interested in all sorts of evolutionary things, including mimicry in butterflies and moths. And Alice bred specimens for him, discussed ideas with him, and supported his work. And she had similar sort of liaisons, if you like, with some of the other scientists around. She was an excellent illustrator, drawer.
Yeah, but sadly it's been cancelled because there wasn't.
She painted. So this is a plate from one of Poulton's publications, and she painted some of the butterflies for him. And she drew some stamps, coloured some stamps for a South African stamp. Anyway, lots of things. And she was also elected as a fellow of the Royal Entomological Society in 1916. So she was well respected in academic circles as a naturalist, and she's often remembered as a geneticist in some of the obituaries you read about her. But I'm just going to talk about her moths at the museum. So there's over 8,000 specimens now in the National Museum of Scotland in their collections, beautifully labelled, so you can actually read her handwriting, which is a joy, and mostly they've got site, place and date details on them, so really lovely data there. Perhaps interestingly, I don't really know, but all of her 8,000 specimens, 8,000 plus, are from East Lothian. So although she spent time in London, a lot of time in London and other parts of the country and other parts of the world, we've got no record of any natural history collecting at all from anywhere other than East Lothian. And this sort of focus on her home county, I think, makes her a little bit sort of akin, if you like, to a modern day county moth recorder. She was really interested in the species that were in her home patch, if you like. So she did a lot of collecting herself, but she also was well known, people would send her stuff they'd seen. And she rescued some mouldering collections of some elderly gentlemen as well, and added those to her collection, extracting the data and trying to work out where everything came from. And then she published in 1930, so she was 80 by then. This is sort of a sum of her life's work, I guess, a paper called Butterflies and Moths Found in East Lothian. And for me, as a current day mother in East Lothian, this is a really interesting list to read. So it's all the species she thought were around then. But also this, the first page, I should have put the reference on it, but the first page is quite interesting as well, quite insightful. So she's really trying to work out why East Lothian has the species that it has and why they're different from elsewhere. Why are there more variety of butterflies and moths in the south of England compared to East Lothian and things like that. And she says, no doubt cultivation and unfortunately golf, her brother was a big golf player, have exterminated many species. Climate seems also to have affected the range of some, but this is somewhat puzzling and requires more investigation. So even back then, 100 years ago, and she would have been discussing these ideas with her contemporaries, I'm sure, they were, considering the impact of their cultivation, their land use. And this word climate comes in as well, of course, and this is way before climate change as we know it. So as well as her specimens, we've got various paper records in her archives. And these are really fascinating. So there's catalogues which relate to her pin specimens, giving us a little bit more detail about them. There's various lists of moths to look for in different months of the year, lists of caterpillars. She seems to have been one of these really organised, ordered ladies with lots of list keeping and things like that. And there's some letters at the front of that picture there, some correspondence from Poulton here at Oxford, which she was clearly friendly with him. So there's lots of sort of personal insights into some of the scientific thoughts going on at the time, things like leaf mines and some interesting snippets in there. But perhaps most valuable, most interesting to me is this Diary of East Lothian Lepidoptera, the green book at the front, which she began in 1913, so aged 63. And if we look at all her specimens and her notes, from about 1910, so from about the age of 60 to the age of 75 is when she did most of her recording and had most of her sort of successes, if you like, which I think is really nice to know that we've got plenty of time, all of us, to get going and get some good finds in. So this is just a random page from this diary, and it contains lists of the species she saw, not just the ones that have ended up on a pin, but all the species she saw, or who knows, she might not have written down everything, of course. And then there's more detail about them. So whether they're at rest or at flight, whether she caught them at sugar or light, the time of day, so the last column there is hour. And then as well as just the species, she's got information about the weather, about the plants, whether it's a forward year or a backward year, as she calls it, and comments on what she thinks of the abundances. And in amongst all that, you get, by reading through it, you get a sort of insight into what she was like as a moth recorder and some of the challenges she faced in her moth recording. And well, from my experience, she seems to have exactly the same complaints, if you like, or sort of moans about things that aren't going according to plan, and weather features frequently. So this is just an example, but she says a bad wet year in some ways. The weather was, I can't read that because of the things downside. The weather was usually unsuitable when there was no moon, and vice versa. She lived through World War I, and that was a big inconvenience in many ways, I'm sure, but in particular in her, for her mothing. So here she says the territorials are on guard with trenches, etc., all around the coast, and no night mothing was possible. And the hollow north of Ravenshew, which is about the best place near the sea, was continually trampled over by them. And then elsewhere, she goes on about not being able to have her light trap at the best side of the house. So the house that faces the sea was clearly where all the interesting moths turned up, but she couldn't have her lights there because of nighttime curfews. Sugar was rationed. She couldn't buy sugar to make her sugaring mix. So it's quite interesting reading about that. And then lastly, visitors. So obviously as her role as sort of manager of the house and supporter of her brother's political career, she did a lot of entertaining of dignitaries and important people from around the world, and they got in the way as well. So sugaring in September and October, very unproductive, best fortnight lost to visitors. And the weather has been beautifully fine and sunny, and we've had a good many warm evenings, but one can't have one's guests and go off mothing. So no, indeed. And my sort of analogy is my mother-in-law, who always wants to come round on the wrong nights. And then the other interesting thing in her notebook, which you don't tend to read so often. So when you look at published papers, you're always seeing people's successes and triumphs and all the brilliant things they've seen, and everyone sort of brushes over all their failures. And you look at social media and it's all like, everyone seems to be having a brilliant time and seeing amazing things. But of course it isn't like that, or it isn't for me. And so in Alice's notes, we get a sense of some of the things that didn't go according to plan. So here she's got on October the 12th, went up to the Lammermuir, so that's a hilly range to the south of the county, in hopes of finding various species, but did not see a moth of any kind. And I've been to the Lammermuirs often and not seen a moth of any kind. And then here she says, L. literana, one after hibernation on trunk of oak, boxed, but escaped just as lid was being put on. So that's another familiar scene. And so I think that's a real value of her diaries, really, is that all this information that you wouldn't just pick up from the species lists and the specimens. So all this together with her specimens was my kind of launching point for going back to where she'd been and seeing what I could find. Swap my slides around. So the species of moths that you see depends on how you go looking for them, as with many groups of animals. So this is just a quick how to find moths slide. So there's all sorts of ways you can look for your moths. Is that day-flying moths are good to get by net. Beating bushes, that umbrella is my beating tray, or sweeping through long vegetation to pick up caterpillars or small moths. There's leaf mines you can look for some species. You can go out after dark with a torch. Sugaring is good for some species, and of course, light traps. And so each of these methods are particularly good for different species. So there'll be some species of moths that come to sugar readily and don't particularly come to light. Obviously, day-flying moths won't come to a light trap. So there's various different ways. Nowadays, I think moth recorders can get quite lazy, and with our modern day light traps, which is so effective at pulling in the moths, this is definitely the most popular and common method to use, and perhaps we're then therefore missing out on some of these other moths that don't so readily come to light. And this slide just shows some of my moth trapping exploits. So I do most of my moth recording is out and about with portable traps that run off batteries. And you can take them up hills, anywhere you want to lug your batteries, really. Leave them running overnight and see what they've caught the following morning. Alice did have a moth trap. She used it at her house. It must have run off electricity, which I guess was probably quite new. And I don't know what bulb technology she had, but I don't suppose it was as bright or as UV rich as our modern bulbs. So there'll be differences in, although we've got the same selection of methods available, the sort of proportion of species we might come across could be different. And I've just thrown in one graph of looking at her data. I like looking at data, but I try to keep clear of this. So this is a graph shows number of records in an average year. So Alice is on the left and Katty, me on the right. And this basically shows the yellow bar is light trap records, so the number of records made from using a light trap, and the green are all other methods combined. And this really just shows that nowadays, me, and I'm not unusual in this, the vast majority of my records are made by light trap, and it really raises the number of moths that we now record compared to 100 years ago. And you can see Alice did much more, or got many more of her records using these other sort of more active methods of searching with a net or breeding caterpillars and things like that. So you would expect some differences, and bearing all those sort of biases in mind. Just a quick look at some of the numbers. So this is a map of East Lothian, and the blue dots are Alice's records. So that's where moths were recorded by her and a few of her contemporaries as well. So these are all the moths recorded that we know of in East Lothian in between 1860 and 1930, something like that. The yellow dots are my dots over a much shorter time period. And you can see the yellow clusters are where my popular light trapping spots are. So I go back time and again, but never quite put my trap in exactly the same spot. So we both cover a similar sort of area of East Lothian, I guess. I have many more traps along the coast than she did. And of course, I'm only one moth recorder. There are others of us in East Lothian, not many actually, but there are other people. So there'll be even more modern day dots coming in than just the yellow ones on that map suggest. So here we have some numbers. So this is species list. So this is the total number of species in, so Alice's list in her published paper, she reckoned there were 585 species of moths in East Lothian, 290 of which were macros. So that's the larger species of moth. And if we look at the National Moth Recording Scheme, so that's where all of our moth records now go, just for the last 20 years, so just the moths that have been seen in East Lothian since the year 2000, we've got 920 species on that list, 380 of which are macros. So you can see there's been a huge increase in number of species seen in East Lothian, which sounds quite good, really. Part of that will be because of the increased recording effort, the better light traps, there's more of us looking. We've got much better knowledge now of where species might be. So there's a lot of targeted searching that goes on now. But even so, it's a big hike. And we're just going to look at a few. Oh, that's my list. So I've got some way to go. So in 5 or 6 years of mothing in East Lothian, I've got as far as 357, apparently. I had to ask my county moth recorder for that figure. So here are some of the species that have arrived. So we've had 100 new species since the year 2000. So in the last 20 years, 100 new macro moths have been recorded in East Lothian, which is quite a big number, I think. I was quite surprised. So partly that reflects some not very much recording going on between 1930 and 1980 or something like that. But anyway, a few of the species, we've got Blair's shoulder knot. So Alice may not even have heard of this species. It's a new arrival in the UK, turned up in the Isle of Wight, I think, in the 1950s, and has been moving northwards rapidly ever since, and it's now halfway up Scotland. The caterpillars like Lelandii, so it's got plenty of suburban choice. Clouded silver, this is a lovely, lovely moth. Would have been around in Scotland 100 years ago, or there are some historic records from the southwest, but not in the east of the country. And now it's pretty widespread across sort of lowland areas. And then canary shouldered thorn. So this beautiful, fluffy, sort of charismatic moth with their lovely feathery antennae and sort of pouty beak, to use unscientific terms. This would have been well, probably in East Lothian. It's not recorded in East Lothian, but it's been recorded from other parts of Scotland 100 years ago. It would have been around probably. No idea whether it was as numerous. It's a moth that comes nowadays. We catch them by light mostly. Caterpillars are hard to come by and things. So maybe it was around in Alice's day, but she just didn't have the right equipment to be able to catch up with it, which is a shame for her. I think she would have liked that one. But it just also goes to show that however hard you try, there will be species that slip under your radar. So then we've got not many species, but we've got a few species that haven't been seen since the year 2000. 10 species, in fact. And most of these haven't been seen since Alice recorded them. So she was the last person to see these moths in this part of Scotland. V-moth, seen a massive decline across the UK. Its caterpillars feed on currant bushes, and there's all sorts of guesses as to why it might have declined so much. It could be climate change, it could be different cultivars of currants, it could be pesticides, who knows, but it's a really, really significant decline across the UK. Heath rivulet is a day-flying moth, so we don't have to worry about differences in light trapping effectiveness to compare this, but it's quite a small moth and it's in upland places, so quite hard to come by, and you really need to be a naturalist looking for it to come across it. And I've been back to these places that Alice found it, trying desperately to see if I can find it, and no luck yet, but I haven't given up. The Lammermuir Hills for a big place. And then Portland moth, again, this is a rare moth now. It's on Butterfly Conservation's priority list, Scotland priority list. Alice was pretty excited to get this. She had it in her garden trap a few times. Lucky lady. I've looked for this one on the coast in East Lothian, but no chance. It does occur in Fife at Tentsmuir, so it is still around, but nowhere near as common as it once was. And then we've got a whole load of species that have stayed in East Lothian. So these are species that Alice recorded, and we can still find them now. And so there's a selection here. So you have a list of moths, but you've got the same list now as 100 years ago, but that doesn't give you any information about how the numbers might have changed. So they could be more common or less common or the same. So poplar hawk moth, which is probably our most common hawk moth in Scotland, definitely the one I see the most, and I see a lot of them each year. Alice records this as rare. So does that mean it was much, much rarer back then? I think a big moth like that, it's the sort of moth that members of the public see and send in records. So it suggests that probably it has become more common. Mallow, which is one of my favourite moths. It might be brown, but it's beautiful. This was, Alice called it moderately common. She was the last person to record it in East Lothian until it was rediscovered in 2019. And since that rediscovery, I've been searching roadside verges for the caterpillars. So the caterpillars feed on common mallow plants and have found quite a lot in East Lothian. So at the moment, that's the only place it's known from in Scotland. But it just makes you wonder, or makes me wonder, has it been here all the time since Alice's day and just slipped under people's radar? Or has it gone? Is it now making a comeback? So it'll be interesting to see now COVID seems to have gone away, touch wood, and we'll be able to spread out our search for caterpillars for this species. And then Mauvais du jour. So this is got a friend who calls it the mint choc chip moth because of its colour scheme. Beautiful moth, quite common in East Lothian, in southern Scotland, in oak woodlands. I get them at sugar, which is what this one is. Get them in my light traps. And Alice said it was very common at sugar, and she had it in her light traps. And she also says at rest on trunks of trees in the afternoon. So when I read that, I started looking at trunks of trees in the afternoon in the oak woodlands where I trap the species in my light traps, and I've not found one. So I don't know whether that's my poor fieldcraft skills that I get so used to using light traps that I don't, I've lost the ability to spot moths on trees, or whether it's a decline. You know, it suggests a decline. And nowadays, there's so many people recording moths, we actually get millions of records. I think it's about 1 million records a year or something like that come into the National Moth Recording Scheme. So a huge amount of data coming in. And there's been really good data for the last 30, 40 years, which means that for that time period, so back to about 1970s, we've got sufficient data for clever statisticians and powerful computers to get quite a good idea of trends for many of our species, many of our macro moth species anyway. And we can actually have a good idea whether they've increased or decreased in both abundance and range. But it's interesting to try and think, what about 100 years ago? So that's, you know, much further back. And can we look at Alice's notes and infer anything from that? The answer is probably not, but we're going to have a go. So Yellowshell, this is a common moth now, really common. You see it by day flitting in hedgerows. But Alice says that these congregated in large numbers in one hawthorn tree near a pine wood in 1917. And this idea, she has it quite a lot, sort of congregations of moths and thousands of moths and hundreds in the herbage. That's not my impression of the abundance of moths nowadays. And we've got small Argentine sable, so that's still around, but very localized in the hills in East Lothian. She found it in roadside herbage. So does that suggest it was, I think that suggests it was probably more widely distributed. And Muslim footman, many more specimens than I have ever seen before in 1918. And this species, looking at the more modern data, is one that has seen huge increase in numbers and range over the last 50 years. But maybe this is suggesting that that upward trend started a lot earlier. So, I'm just going to, so we've talked about changes in the way we look for moths, slight differences in that, differences in the species. And what about how we identify our moths and how we record them? And making a biological record, being able to identify what you see is pretty fundamental. And for moths, it's actually, of all the insects, macro moths must be one of the easier groups to identify because of their sort of big coloured wings. So I'm going to talk about one of Alice's pugs. This slide is a slightly random slide actually, but it's just to show you, before I show you some dull brown photographs of moths, that pugs can actually be very beautiful. This is a pimpernel pug from East Lothian, another species that's been recorded very recently for the first time. So what did Alice use to identify her moths? She had books. So obviously money wasn't a particular barrier to her, so she had the books that she wanted. This one she uses a lot, Lepidoptera of the British Islands, in 11 volumes. You can buy second-hand copies for a few £1,000s now. But luckily, it's on the Biodiversity Heritage Library, so you can look at a copy. And it's a brilliant book. I love these old books. So this page here is just part of one entry for one of the pugs. And it goes into so much detail about what the moth looks like, where it's found, what the caterpillars are like, its natural history. So loads more information than our modern day books give, and definitely relevant today as well. So I recommend looking at these old books if you've got a chance. She also, and so the Barrett book had coloured plates in as well, and they were very much based on pinned specimens. So back then, Alice collected anything she wasn't sure what was, and she would have pinned it and used that to identify the species. And so the descriptions and the illustrations are all based on this sort of spread-eagled wing position, which we don't have in our modern books so much now. So she had other books as well. This one, Merrick's Handbook of British Lepidoptera. This is a really difficult book to penetrate. No colour pictures, very few diagrams, and it's all about wing veination and antennal structure, and more familiar probably to those of you who do beetles and spiders and that sort of thing. So nowadays, for moths in the UK, we don't really use those sorts of features to identify. That's a sweeping statement. There are micromoths that we do need that for. So nowadays, we've got all manner of books available to us, colour pictures, different groups, distribution maps, flight times, huge amount of information. And if you don't want to buy books or you can't afford books, then there's websites as well with national ones, regional ones. Identification aids available to all. And then of course we've got digital cameras or phone cameras. We can take pictures, we can email them, we can put them on social media. You can get help with your identification within a day, sometimes within that hour, really quick help, and help from lots of people as well. So you can get different opinions if you like. And then I'm not going to talk about these bottom two things, but there's new technologies emerging. So there's automatic recognition apps are becoming quite popular for some people, and they apparently work quite well for moths. And then DNA sequencing, which barcoding, which helps identify species, is used a lot in science at the moment, but could it become something that we all have a handheld sequencer when we go in the field? I don't know. So talking of one of Alice's pugs, this is her pug collection, and you can see that they all look quite similar. She struggled quite a lot with identifying her pugs, so in her notebooks, we have lots of just pug written with no attempt to identify the species. So she sought help, and she was well connected. She knew people who could help her. So highlighted here is Eupithecia, which is the genus name for pug, Plumbeolata, and she found it on Beating Hedge on the hill beyond Notting Place. You can actually, well, there is a big chestnut tree on this road, so I don't know whether that was where she meant. So although she's named it in that note there, I'm not sure she named it straight away. Looking at it with modern eyes, it would be quite an interesting record. So this is what we know of its distribution in Scotland. The yellow dots are the historic records we know of. The pink ones are more modern records. If you look at books, old books, it does say that it's distributed all the way up to Orkney. So maybe it was more widespread than the information we know of. But it would be really interesting to know if it was in East Lothian, which is, it's in the southeast corner, just above the pink dot at the bottom. So Alice would have, in her notebooks, you can see lists of the pug species, ones that she thought were in East Lothian, ones that she thought were in Scotland, and the red writing there are the people that she sought help for identification with. So she tried her local mates first, and then if they weren't sure, she wasn't sure, she sent them down to London or Oxford. So it went first to Poulton in Oxford, and then he sent them on. And I don't know, this box is up in the Museum Collection Centre in Edinburgh. It says Miss A. Balfour, Whittingham, Haddington, Scotland on the front. And I don't know whether she put her specimens in this box and sent them down south to get help with. So her lead-coloured pug, we can infer some of what happened to it on its journey to be identified from letters from Professor Poulton. So this chap here, Louis Beethoven Prout, who was based at the British Museum, now the Natural History Museum, he got to look at her specimens, and it was clearly a great honour. So there's lots of just a sort of selection of comments here, but there's lots of the greatest authority in geometry, Mr. L.B. Prout. I could not induce him to do it, but Mr. Riley succeeded. And then later he says, this is Poulton writing, it will make the specimens of much greater value to the Edinburgh Museum when they get them to know that the greatest authority on geometry has determined them. So Prout was a really good lepidopterist, did publish masses of things. And so what an honour that he deigned to finally look at her moths for her. So here it is, the lead-coloured pug. She was told to put det L.B. Prout, determined by L.B. Prout, 1923. So she caught it in 1916. It took 7 years before she got a name to it. So that must have been quite tricky to learn from your mistakes and things. I showed it to a modern day pug expert, Roy Leverton in Scotland. And he took one look at it and said, that's not a lead-coloured pug. And he sent me this photograph of a lead-coloured pug. And he said, the wing shape's all wrong, you know, a completely different wing shape. And if you know that you're looking for a different wing shape, you can spot the difference, but really difficult. It actually turns out that the July date is wrong for lead-coloured pug as well. So it seems that Mr. Prout got this one wrong, which we don't know the story behind it. We don't know how long he'd looked at it, whether indeed he even did look at it. And all her other determinations by him are right. So, but I think the message here is that just as back then, just as now, experts aren't always right. But we do now have a much better system of checks and balances. So we get anything unusual, we'll have several people looking at it, making sure that it's correct before it gets into the National Moth Recording Scheme. So we've got a much better sort of backup. So finally, what's happened to all these records then? So I've been digitising, I suppose is probably the word, taking her dates and locations of her specimens and entering them into a spreadsheet. And then the county moth recorder, East Lothian County Moth Recorder, has been verifying them, making sure they make sense. And they've gone into the National Moth Recording Scheme to join all the other millions of records there. And as so Alice, without, you know, unwittingly, I suppose, has contributed thousands of records to the National Moth Recording Scheme. There's been a few new species that we didn't know were in East Lothian. Lots of new 10-kilometre square dots, new date ranges. And this is not just the rare and the unusual and the special species. This is lots more information about the really common species as well. So she's got, you know, lots of information about large yellow underwings and silver ground carpets and all these common species. So Alice's records alone probably don't make a huge difference to our knowledge of moths in the UK, but they do improve our knowledge of moths in East Lothian, certainly. But if we look at, this is one of the aisles in the, probably the least ordered aisle, so sorry, Ashley, of the National Museum of Scotland's Collection Centre. So in the greeny cabinets at the bottom, there's drawers and drawers of moths, which we know what are, but none of the, or very little of the data has been extracted onto any modern database. And then above that, all those boxes, we don't even really know what's in those. There's a huge amount of data within, this is Edinburgh Museum, but there's museums everywhere with boxes of moths, and must be a huge amount of data. And if all of that was digitized, I appreciate that's unlikely to be possible, huge task. You know, what a lot of information you would have. But I sort of want to finish really by saying that there's more to biological records than just a dot on a map and a number. So with Alice's notes, there's all this rich sort of layer underneath about things she didn't see, about explanations for a good catch or explanations for a poor catch, information about the weather. So all this information that might explain some of the data, that all gets lost when it gets into a spreadsheet and onto a database. It sort of gets unmarried from the sort of background details. So rather naff picture to finish. I thought it looked really good at home, but now it's up there. Completely thrown. So I was going to say, you know, it'd be really interesting. I picked up this picture of what moths were like 100 years ago in East Lothian through Alice's notes. You get an idea in your head of what it might have been like to be a moth recorder 100 years ago, but it'd be really interesting to go back and see how accurate that is. You know, how accurate are Alice's notes, or how accurate is my interpretation of Alice's notes? You know, what was it really like? And or invite Alice into the present and see what she makes of the moths now. You know, would she be astounded at how few there are? Would she be amazed at the variety? What would she think of our moth recording and trapping equipment? You know, would she be amazed and impressed, or would she just think that's newfangled nonsense and we're doing it all wrong, and why don't we just go and hunt for our moths like she used to? So methods change, the moths change, the habitats change, but I think probably the motivations for moth recorders, for biological recorders, stays much the same as we go through time. Alice was very interested in what she was finding and why it was there, why things were in one place and not the other. And that's exactly the same sorts of questions that we're asking now, although we have kind of bigger questions that we're trying to address as well, of course. And I just hope that in 100 years from now, there'll still be biological recorders gamboling through the undergrowth looking for species. Hope they've got moths to find or things to find. And, you know, hope everyone's just as excited by recording wildlife for the sake of recording wildlife, as well as for all the information that it gives us and helps in terms of making our decisions. The end.
How do you do it? This is something I should learn. Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful, I don't know, a jaunt through Scottish countryside through the ages. That was lovely, and I have to confess, moths are one of my favourite groups, so I particularly enjoyed it. Thank you. So we're gonna, we've got quite a few minutes for questions if people have them. It would be lovely if you did. So we've got one already. I'm just gonna run around the room and hope. It might be that you need to repeat the question before you answer it.
Thank you, that's really fascinating, thank you. I was just wondering, did you ever find out what the mystery pug was?
Okay, do I need to repeat that question? So I've been asked whether I know what the mystery pug is. I'm not really the person to ask about pugs. I struggle with them each year. I think I've got it. And then of course a year passes before that particular species appears again and I've completely forgotten it. I think it's a marsh pug. So there we are. She has got other pugs in her collection, and if you kind of match them up side by side, it looks most like a marsh pug. So I suspect that's what it was, which I don't, it's not a particularly numerous species actually.
Did you get a DNA confirmation to it?
I'm sure you could get a DNA confirmation. You could probably dissect its genitalia and find out what it was, but I'm not sure whether we need to do that. Yeah.
Have we got any more?
Yes. Yeah, so we've had one question come in from the online chat, which is in relation to, you mentioned the 12th of October experience of finding no moths at all, and that's apparently raised a number of questions in the chat about the more general issue of how we record the absence of things. So it goes a bit wider than just moths. Is there anything that you would like to
There's quite a lot I would like to say on zeros. I've got a lot to say on zeros and biological recording. I think we really need to find a way to record them. I appreciate how do you record a zero, because someone can go on a rubbish day and record nothing, and that's because the weather's rubbish, or they might be hopeless and looking in completely the wrong place. So that's why they record nothing. So it's really difficult. I've just recently been looking for Rannoch brindled beauty moths in Scotland by looking on fence posts, and you find them in some places and you don't find them in others. And it would be really nice to be able to have a way that you can record them where you don't find them. And I think you can actually in iRecord. There is now a place you can put zero in. But then that raises problems because the National Moth Recording Scheme doesn't have a facility for zeros. So there's a whole issue with data flow. It's really complicated. So I think it would be great if we could somehow record effort in our recording and zeros, but I don't know how to do it. Ask Martin, he probably got a better idea.
Well, it sounds like we made a start, but that's something for us to think about. Another question in the room?
Hi, perhaps another rather nerdy point, but I noticed on your comparative map of your records and Alice's, most of her records seem to fit a grid map.
Yes.
Was that because she was deliberately using that, or was it because of the way you've subsequently analysed?
Yeah, I meant to say that in my words. That's because so her locations are all place names. So if she says Whittingham or something, I've assigned that a 1K square grid reference. So that's how it ends up like that. So that map has plotted it in the top corner of each 1 kilometre square grid reference. So that's how it comes out. I did try and experiment with heat maps and things like that, which look better, sort of look better, but look worse in other ways. So I just kept it like that. That's the reason.
Any other questions?
Did Alice mention in her letters or notes or diaries why she started to collect moths, what her interest was in that at all, and how does that kind of compare with where you find yourself in your career and why you decided to do that?
Whoa. Okay. So I've been asked to repeat that question. So I was asked, why do I know why Alice got into moths or how she got into moths? And is there any parallels with how I've got into moths and do what I do? So there's bits and pieces of information about the Balfour children as youngsters, sort of roaming around the East Lothian countryside, and they had their own museum and they collected specimens and they shot birds and stuffed them and did all the collected fossils from the beach. They went out in a boat and did some dredging for mollusks or something. So they were interested in natural history as a family. And I'm not really sure why Alice ended up with butterflies and moths. Her brother, she had one brother who was very good at biology and became, I think he became a fellow of the Royal Society, tragically died at the age of 30. But he and her were very close, and he was a good natural historian. So I don't know why it was moths. She's interested in gardening and plants as well, but didn't record them. And in terms of comparing me to her, I don't really know how I came into moths. I think it's just one of those things of circumstance. So I've always been into natural history. I did everything as a child, got into birds as a teenager because that was the easiest thing to do. And I've done sort of veered into invertebrates because they're the coolest thing on this planet. And yeah, I did spiders for a while, and it just so happened, actually I used to live in Newbury and volunteer on Greenham Common. And I just went along to a moth trapping evening one night there. And it's just circumstance. When we moved up to Scotland, I happened to meet someone who did moths. So I think probably maybe with Alice as well, I think there was a family friend who was quite influential to her, who collected butterflies. So I guess there's a whole load of different influences, and you just end up doing what you do.
Lovely, thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. Are there any more online ones? No? Are there any more in the room?
Oh, you know what I forgot to do? Acknowledge all these people. Is that what your question was?
I haven't asked this before. If you could sit down with Alice, what one question would you want to ask her?
Oh, I don't know. I'd probably ask her something like, "What's your favourite moth?" or something like that. Yeah, I think something like that. There's so many things that would be interesting to know. Yeah, I don't know. What's your favourite moth? What's my favourite moth? Well, probably the tissue, but that's a whole other talk, a hibernating species.
Okay, well, if you'd all like to help me thanking Katty for a wonderful talk, we really enjoyed that. Thank you.